Tenemos el privilegio de escuchar a una de las investigadoras más reconocidas a nivel mundial en el tema de la evaluación de programas de promoción de la salud e inequidades sociales en salud. Ella es la profesora Lous Potvin de Canadá. La profesora Lous es psicóloga con maestría en psicología, doctora en salud pública de la Universidad de Montreal, con formación postdoctoral en epidemiología clínica y en evaluación. Actualmente es profesora titular del Departamento de Medicina Social y Preventiva de la Universidad de Montreal. Es directora científica del recientemente creado Centro Lea-Roback para el estudio de las inequidades sociales en salud en Montreal.
First, I would really like to thank Fabian and his team for this invitation. It's always a pleasure to come to Colombia, and it's always humbling coming from the north to talk to you about social health inequalities. You experience it daily in your daily life, and your children experience it, your parents have experienced it way more than we do in the north. I guess the only advantage I can have is bringing you a little bit of what we've tried to solve and diminish our problem. But as an introduction to this conference, can I have the first slide, please? Is it possible to have the first slide? Sorry. Thank you. I was thinking that we could do a broad overview of what the literature tells us about health inequalities and the ways to address this problem. Thank you very much. So this is going to be the plan of my presentation. And let's start by just making a very simple distinction. Inequality usually refers to a difference in quantity. We're all unequal. But inequity refers to a value judgment. It's a value. And in health, we're used to deal with values because we believe that health is one of the values that human beings should strive for and have the conditions to achieve. So inequity, it's essentially a value judgment about the fairness of unequal state of affairs. Nobody among us would really believe that it is unfair that my father, who's 86 years old, is going to die before me. But every one of you would believe it is unfair if a child dies before the age of 5 because he's born in the wrong family. So I would like to discuss a few facts that I think needs to be taken into account when we're discussing health inequalities and equity in health. First off, and that's the good news, that's a very good news, our health is collectively improving. So these are life expectancies at birth for development classification, and these are data from the World Bank, okay, from WHO, sorry. And as you can see, difficult, you don't see it, the plain line is the world. And the bottom line is the developing country. The one that's just above it is more developed country, and I believe that Latin American countries are mostly in that line and the developed world. So what you can see is that we're still improving our health. In the northern country like Canada, this is still improving, even though women now are living at an age that's close to 84 years old in Canada. And it's still improving. So we don't really know. We believe that the limit of aging in human being might be around 100, 110, but we don't really know that. So there's still room for improvement in a lot of countries, and that's the good news that's coming from the north. In terms of Latin America, so you can see that it's still improving. That's from 2002 to 2012, 10. It's still improving. Colombia is the red line, so you've gained something like 2 years in 10 years. It is a good rate of improvement, but you're not still at the rate of improvement that the North has, even though the ceiling effect of what we're seeing in the North is kicking in. Another health indicator that is interesting when we're discussing health inequality, of course, is infant mortality. Infant mortality is very sensitive to adverse conditions. And as you can see, in the past 50 years or so, globally, the infant mortality has decreased dramatically, but not as much, indeed, in the developing country as it is in the developed country, and countries in Latin America are about at the world level at this point in time. In Canada, we're at about 5 per 1,000 live births, so which is one of the lowest in the world. And we know that's not the healthcare system. I mean, to go from 7 or 8 to 5, it's the healthcare system. But to go down to 10 live births per 1,000, it's local conditions, it's pregnancy following up of pregnancies, and essentially the conditions in which pregnant women live. This is what I was. It doesn't want to show Colombia. Huh? So this is the data for Colombia. Except for the glitch in 2010, it's a nice way of saying that you're improving your situation. You're at the world level at this time in history, and probably you can still, if we benchmark with what's happening in the north, gain about 10 live birth by 10 less infant mortality by 1,000 live birth. The second fact about health globally is that health is not improving equally for all. And, well, the Black Report, but I want to stress this idea that's fundamental in the Black Report. It's not a question of being poor or rich. It's a question of social hierarchy. And wherever you are in this hierarchy, you're worse off than the one above you and better off than the one below you. So it's not only a question of being lifted out of poverty. It's a question of learning what is to learn to the fact that our societies are hierarchical societies. We're not equal, we're not socially equal, and this reflects in our health. So how does it go? Well, this is, and just the scale there is logarithmic, meaning that normally it would be a nice asymptotic curve. But what you can see is in 2010, here is, in blue are African countries, in pink are Asian countries, American countries are in green. You can see that Colombia, with the arrow, is about at the average where it is compared to other countries with this type of income per person. Big exceptions, we all know them. South Africa has a much higher mortality or lower life expectancy than the income of the South African should preclude. we know that this is a disorganized country that is organizing itself, huge inequities, and other exceptions, Costa Rica and Cuba, with a much higher life expectancy than the income of the people living there would preclude. So this is globally. Well, it's also in nations, and these are data for Canada, and what you can see is life expectancy, remaining life expectancy at the age 25 by income decile from the lowest to the highest. So by the age 25, a Canadian male can expect, at the lowest decile of income, can expect to live another 48 years until the age 73, whereas those at the highest level of income can expect to live another 56 years until the age of 81. So that's essentially a 12-year difference. And we all know that the gradient, because that's what it's called, the gradient, is usually less sharp for women than for men. Women live longer, and the difference between those at the top of the hierarchy and those at the bottom of the hierarchy is less accentuated. I'm trying, sorry. So, and this is true, and this is what our studies have shown as well. This is true for very small area. We see the same in Montreal. Montreal is 2 million people, about the size of Cali. And we can see as well that there is a 6 years life expectancy difference for male at the top of the social hierarchy compared to those at the bottom. Same for infant mortality. We see the same differences between those at the top of the social hierarchy and those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. So at the beginning of your life, if you won the good number in the lottery to be born in a wealthy family, your chances in life are better than if you were having another type of ticket in that lottery. So, markers of health inequalities, and these are the social determinants. In Canada, because we've studied them, there are two big markers of inequality: income and being First Nation, Inuit, and Métis, even more those living on reserve. There's a 10-year difference between the First Nation people who are living on reserve compared to those, to the Canadian population. There are, in Canada, which is the richest country in the world in terms of freshwater reserve, there are some reserves in the north where people do not have access to drinkable water, clean drinkable water. It has to be imported from the south. Education is one, gender is one, but also living in remote and rural area is also determinants of health in Canada, and as well the immigrant status. The immigrant status is a kind of a difficult one to grasp, because immigrants have a tendency to be healthier when they come, but because their income is not as at the par with those of being born in Canada, usually their relative advantage decreases as they age and as the longer they are in here. So I would say that this is true for Canada. That's not true for Europe. We know that. Income is true, but being First Nation is not true. Being First Nation is true for Australia as well, and for a lot of other countries in the world. We don't know for Latin America. We don't have the data. So I would say that one of the first tasks for research is really to map out, to know what are the social determinants. What is the social hierarchy that gets under people's skin made of in your particular circumstances? You cannot import from the north the social determinants. They are context bound, and they are definitely linked to the living conditions in your country. I was able to get a few data from Colombia, from the World Bank, and this is infant mortality year 2010 in Colombia. So you can see that income, and these are by quintile of income. So income is a social determinant of health, of infant health in Colombia. In terms of infant mortality, there's a risk that about 50% higher for children living in family in the lowest income quintile compared to children living in the highest income quintile. And as for stunting, which is growth retardation for children, the risk is more than double. Obesity among non-pregnant women is an interesting one. So what you can see is the reverse of the gradient within the past 10 years. So you had the epidemiological situation in terms of obesity of non-pregnant women of developing countries until 2005, and you can see that the gradient in 2005 is less sharp than before and completely reversed in 2010. So you've reached the situation of developed world when it comes to women obesity. The third fact that I think in this starts then to be more troubling. Those inequalities are not given. They're not natural. They result from our political choices. We choose the level of inequalities that we're willing to live with, and not only do we do that, but collectively we choose who's the winner, who's the loser. And I'll try to demonstrate it. So you can see that these are the Gini coefficient. Basically, for those who don't know, Gini coefficient varies from 0 to 1. 0, everybody would have the same income. 1, one person would have all the wealth of a country. Okay? So 0 to 1. So you can see that among OECD countries, Sweden is among one of the lowest at 0.25, and the United States at 0.37, and the United Kingdom at 0.35 are at about the highest we find in OECD country. Canada, Germany, France are at about 0.20, between 0.25 and 0.30. So this is the result of political choice. What kind of employment policy we promote, what kind of fiscal policy we promote, and how we redistribute the wealth that we collectively produce across all people in our society. I'm really having problems, I'm sorry. So this is Gini coefficient, and below, and this is 2002 and 2011 for Latin American country. I did point an arrow to Colombia. So what you can see is you're pretty high. You're sitting at about 55, and you haven't moved for the past 10 years in terms of social inequalities. Whereas a lot of countries in Latin America, those who are really at the bottom, the distance between this point, the specific point and the blue line is an improvement in Gini. So you can see that Venezuela has improved a lot. You know, went from 0.53 in 2002 to about the level of the United States in 2011. Brazil, which is still very high, but did improve. Uruguay, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Argentina are all countries which have redistributed a little bit their wealth. But what is also striking is none of them is lower than the worst OECD country. So again, I mean, a little bit of room for improvement here for Latin American country. But there was improvement. I mean, in Colombia in 2002, and this is, you know, the rate of poverty and the rate of indigence are really extreme, and they don't give you the whole variation. But what you can see is that in Colombia, the rate of poverty, people living in poverty, has decreased from about 50% to 37%. But in some country, the decrease has been way more dramatic, and in some country, it hasn't happened at all. When it starts to be really troubling, is that we collectively choose who are the losers and the winners. And this is statistics of children and elderly, and the proportion of children and elderly living in conditions of poverty in those selected OECD countries. So what you can see is in the United States is about a fourth elderly and children, and they don't care, so they don't address this problem. In Canada, in the beginning of the 1980s, our Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, was literally called upon in public by an elderly woman, telling him, hey, what are you doing for us? And it kind of, at this point, the Canadian government decided that elderly people shouldn't be poor. So by a series of measures, we were able to decrease the number of elderly people living, the proportion of elderly people living in poverty from 35% to 5% by programs and fiscal policies. Well, we didn't do much for children, unfortunately. So Canada is a good country to age, not a good country to be born. In United Kingdom, despite Tony Blair, in the most recent data, all the elderly and the children were also, the proportion was also increasing. Interestingly, in a place like Sweden and Germany, this is still low, fluctuates, but essentially, by what we do at the political level on the social determinants of health, we collectively decide who will win, who will die. And this example is from, again, OECD country, and the light blue line is the proportion of children living in poverty before tax, and in the black line, it's the same proportion of children living in poverty after tax and redistributive programs. And I want to point that a French baby born in France before tax would be among the worst off in the world. But that same French baby, because France believes that children shouldn't be born into poverty, through a series of programs that improve the life of families, this proportion is lower than 10%, one of the lowest in the world. So tax and programs and policy solutions are a way to change the social hierarchies that are impacting our health. So essentially, promoting health equity is a question of social justice. And why should we be doing it? First, inequalities are costly. This is data from a Canadian province, Manitoba, in which they were able to show that at the middle point of the income distribution, those people use up 8% of the global spending on healthcare. So as you can see, if you go towards the right, higher income, they use less of that. And the more you go towards a lower income end of the distribution, the more they use up the healthcare dollars. So almost double in the lowest decile. So these people are more sick, they're using more healthcare. But, you know, costly, we know that. We know that it is costly to address health inequalities. So why else should we be addressing them? Another reason is that inequalities and health inequalities lower the overall life expectancy in a population. This is interesting data, and any one of these points, and the blue points, is in the US. It's a US city. So you see LA is Los Angeles, these are states, no, sorry, these are states. So LA is Louisiana, MS is Missouri, and down to New York at the bottom. And you see in red the Canadian provinces. So this thing tells you two things. And this is the rate, the mortality rate, and this is the income, a measure of income distribution. So what you see is in the US, the relationship between mortality and income distribution is sharper, meaning that there are something that we do in Canada that they don't do in the US, i.e. social security policies. So we decrease the impact of inequalities on health. But even more than that, what you can see is there's a sharp relationship between areas in which inequalities are higher and mortality. So taking care of the poor and those at the bottom end of the distribution is good for everybody's health. The third reason is that inequalities increase through life. And this is our own work at the Montreal Public Health Directorate, where we're able to document that when you're born, if you're among the poorest, you have higher low birth rate, more premature birth, higher rate of fetal growth retardation. But not only do you have a bad start in life, but when you come to school, you're less ready, you are more likely to have speech problems, to have communication problems, to have cognitive development, emotional immaturity, and social competence retardation. Well, and you're less likely to stay in school because you're not as good. In addition, if you haven't stayed in school, you will have a professional life that will put you more in a socially vulnerable group. You will have a lower income. You will have difficulty to adapt to changes, especially technological changes, and less stable employment. You are more likely to go from one job to the other. You will live, if you're in Montreal, in a neighborhood where the average income is lower, And you will probably live in a neighborhood where a lot of people around you are like you. In those poorer neighborhoods, we've shown that there's way more degraded housing accommodation, more injuries among pedestrians, cyclists, motor vehicle drivers and passengers, and more health impact from the heat waves that we have in the summer. Well, at the end of the day, sorry. So at the end of the day, if you're a man, you will live on average 6 years less if you're in the lower income quintile than if you're in the higher income quintile. So the sooner we address in the life of people, the sooner we address this idea of inequality, the more likely it's going to have a high impact on their life and on their health. And the fourth, and especially for us, public health people, what we do in terms of preventions has more effect on people like us. So what we do in terms of prevention increase those inequalities if we don't pay attention. And this is smoking cessation rates in the UK, and that's just an example. And smoking is probably the textbook example of the inequity that we create in public health. You can see the blue bars were the proportion of people quitting smoking in 1973. And you probably don't know, but in the North, we all know that those past 50 years have been a huge anti-smoking tobacco campaign. In Canada, for example, we've reduced the prevalence of smoking from 60% to less than 20%. But if you look who has increased its rate of stopping smoking, it's those at the top of the social hierarchy. You can see by the steepness of the slope. So what we do in public health, if we don't pay attention, increases social inequalities. And a Canadian task force on the role of healthcare system for health inequality has just proposed this model, that if we have prevention, universal prevention programs, and those who are less vulnerable, they start at a higher place to start with, take it up way more rapidly than those who are more vulnerable. And unless you have corrective situations or action in the health care sector and in prevention, has an effect to increase those inequalities, even though healthcare is a redistributive process of wealth in a society. But again, we don't redistribute it equally. So I'll let you read those things and see those images. It's not only in the South that people have the wrong numbers in life. And just to quote Nelson Mandela, there's no better indicator of the soul of a society than the way it treats its children. And the way it treats its children has a huge impact on the adult that they are going to become. Okay, so what do we do for health inequality? The very first step is to recognize that we have a problem. Produce a report. Alert people. Make it a political, put it on the political agenda. There's no other solution. This has been done in Montreal, 1998. The Director of Public Health in the city of Montreal said, health inequality is my #1 priority. And I'm going, as a physician, I have one patient. As a public health physician, I have one patient. My patient is sick. What makes my patient sick is health inequality. Therefore, I have a responsibility to address those social determinants that make my patient sick. This report. Norway, 2005. Yep. Sorry. The WHO, 2008. Scotland, 2008. England, 2010. And the city of Quebec, 2012. So I hope that we'll see Cali in one of those next slides, or Colombia, or some Latin American city. So what's happening in Latin America? We are starting to see that the epidemiologists are starting to documenting the problem. And I really recommend this 2013 article. And what they've done is they create a health inequality index, which is a lot of health outcomes, a lot of health care, a little bit of wealth and social development. And I urge you to develop index that will take more of those social determinants into consideration. And the social inequalities is at only 2 indicators out of that. So, and in this paper, what they show, of course, is Cuba. Between Cuba and Haiti, there is a huge difference, and Colombia stands somewhere a third the way in the indicator. These are indicators, I mean, they have all the weaknesses and strength and power of indicators. But the very first step is to document the problem. We cannot appeal, we cannot call upon political and policy people unless we show them that there is a problem to be fixed. The second thing, I would say, and I'm showing this model, is to have a kind of a model of how it happens. And well, everybody has a model. I happen to like this one by Mackenbach because it puts, the position in a social hierarchy as the external, as the input in everything of that, and everything is consequent about that. So if you do not address the position in social hierarchy, you may do whatever in terms of behavioral risk factor, in terms of local conditions, in terms of individual vulnerability. You're not going to impact on health. So that's the first thing. And that led some people to propose this nutcracker approach, saying essentially that it's not either social policy or local action. It's both. If you want to address the hierarchy that makes people sick in the first place, it's through public policy on the social determinants of health. Changing, smoothing, flattening the social ladders that make people sick. But whatever you do, there's always going to be winners and losers. And it's locally, where people live, work, and play, that we need to mitigate the effects of those social hierarchy. So essentially, once you've seen that you have a problem, the next step, or the 2 next steps that you should take concurrently is, one is public policy, and the other is strengthen development in the communities. Public policies, I think that there are essentially 3 types of public policy that can address this social hierarchy problem. First is policy that smoothen the social hierarchy. First, a progressive fiscal policy. Policy that supports family, a minimum income for family. Because at the end of the day, those we think are more urgently in need of support and flattening the social hierarchy are children, because they are going to become sick adults. Employment and retirement policy, and policy to support women's work. We've shown in Quebec with a universal program of daycare, low-cost daycare system, that it has 2 effects. First of, children of lower income family who are in daycare have less or increase their readiness to school when it comes to school. So therefore, they are more likely to stay in school. They will have a better income. So this is a flattening effect. But also, it increases the income of the family because women work. When their children are well taken care of, they work, bring more income to the family, and the family can afford better and better resources to make their life. The second type of policy is policies that provide a comparative advantage to those at the bottom of the scale. There's not much that we've done with this regard. About the only thing we know that is effective is water fluoridation to decrease dental decays. We know that. We have ample evidence that this is the case. If we fluoride the water, the drinking water in cities, we have an impact on children, on their oral health and in their overall health. And finally, policies that facilitate access to healthcare. Universal health insurance, drug insurance are a redistributive process. But we know that those who will take more benefit out of that are those who are already better off. So this is really a third-tier strategy. Necessary, but shouldn't expect too much out of that. Well, I'll skip that. I'll skip those examples in the, sorry. Where should I? Can't. I'm sorry. No, we're not there. We'll try. I just tried to finish a little bit, and I'm really sorry for that. Okay. The third. How do I go? No. I want to be here. Okay, the third strategy, and my guess is that Trevor, my colleague Trevor, will talk to you way more and in a much more practical way than I can do for that. But it's to support community action, because at the end of the day, but to make sure that we all agree that community action is a mitigating strategy, meaning that there's whatever you do on the social hierarchy, trying to flatten the social hierarchy, there's still going to be inequalities. There's still going to be inequalities in the quality and quantity of resources that people have locally to build their health. Those resources are housing, food, quality of food, pollution. People living in a dump site cannot be healthy. And we all know that if you are we all know that the lower income you have at your disposition, the more likely you are to be having to live in a place that has a lot of environmental hazard. So because health is mainly produced through living and working environment, through the use of health-promoting resources, it is important that we mitigate in public health, and public health is a way, it's also a local resource for people to act on the quality of the resources that they have locally. Just to give you this little example from the UK, and so you have the least deprived to the most deprived area, okay? And you have in green, in dark green to the lighter green, the number of adverse conditions that people are in, either pollution. So those adverse conditions are water low water quality, no green space, habitat that did not favor biodiversity, flood risk, litter, and those kind of things. So they've mapped in the UK the neighborhoods in terms of the number of environmental hazards that communities were living with. So you can see that in least deprived area, okay, none of them has 3 of those conditions. Whereas in most deprived area, 20% of people live in an area where there are at least 3 of those adverse conditions. So in the social hierarchy goes through your health partly because the place you live, work, and play is not conducive to health. And as public health, we need to include this in our strategies to address health inequalities. So in conclusion, our societies are indeed unequal, but we collectively choose those inequalities. We trick the dices, usually in our favor. Social inequalities transform into health inequalities that affect large segments of the populations. And it's probably truer in Latin America than it is in North America. Over and above recognizing the problem, there are 2 complementary strategies that address health inequalities. First, transform those social hierarchies, flatten them. There's no other way. Find what makes those social hierarchy and flatten them. But concurrently, and as importantly, increase the quality and quantity of local resources to mitigate the effects of those hierarchy where people live, work, and play. And now, as a little bit of an invitation, the IUHPE, the International Union for Health Promotion and Education, is going to have its 22nd World Conference in Curitiba, Brazil in 2016. The theme is promoting health and equity. We're eager to hear what you're going to have done between now and then. Thank you very much.